Hello, welcome to the Sideboard here at the StarCityGames.com Players Championship 2016 edition. I'm Nick Miller alongside Jeff Hoogland. Back for your second Players Championship. Took last year off. You're back in form this year. Very easy qualification in Season 1 where you just dominated pretty much from start to finish.
Yep, we played a lot of Modern.
There was many Modern events. You top-8'd all of them in Season 1.
Yes, I did.
And now you're back. We're going to talk about a Modern deck, but first of all, how do you feel coming into this tournament? How much preparation have you done? You've known you've been qualified for most of the year.
Yeah, this is the most I have ever spent preparing for a Magic tournament to date, which is says a lot because we've spent days before, and this was having 2 weeks between the Invitational, and this was huge. Just countless hours. I've got probably over a dozen of recorded hours of testing that are going to go up on my YouTube page after this event starts, and just feel ready to shuffle some cardboard and battle some nerds.
Yep. Well, you've done a lot of work in Modern. It's only fitting we talk about your Modern deck here today. Now, you've done a lot of work with Angel-Chord previous, but you're playing a Chord of Calling deck this weekend without Kiki at all.
Yep. So the latest iterations of Angel-Chord that I've been playing, like I won the Classic in Baltimore with and the Top 32 the Open in Columbus, were essentially becoming an Abzan deck splashing a triple red card, which put some stress on the mana base. So this was our attempt after the Invitational to make the mana more consistent while also being more powerful with some more utility lands, and I think it does a really good job of doing that.
Nothing more Jeff Hoogland than putting a triple red card into your Abzan deck, but we'll jump into this deck, calling it Angel-Chord. It's basically an Abzan Chord of Calling deck, but it's also got the Archangel of Thune Spike Feeder combo, which we'll get to. Got a bunch of little interactions like that going on here. Starting off with the Angels.
Yep, these are our gals. Archangel of Thune is just our, like you mentioned, our combo card with Spike Feeder, but it's also a soft combo with other cards that we're playing, such as Scavenging Ooze. Those two cards are in Standard together. They do just as much work in Modern. If you get even, 2 Scavenging Ooze activations off while Archangel's on the table, you're generally going to have more than enough power to kill your opponent.
Restoration Angel, just great with basically every card in your deck other than the Angels.
Yeah, in Angel-Chord, you often chained Chord of Callings, Eternal Witness, and Restoration Angels together into a potential combo, but a lot of the time you just beat them down with the Restoration Angel that you essentially got for free since it blinked the Witness and brings the Chord back to your hand, and this offers us still to have that potential on top of the utility with our other creatures.
Linvala. Now, this was popular back in the pod days because Affinity and a bunch of, Birthing Pod itself happening. How's it fill its role here?
So Linvala just has fairly reasonable stats as just a 3/4 flyer for 4. Her text box is especially relevant in the Bant Eldrazi matchup, though. Eldrazi Displacer is easily their most important card in that matchup, and I think that's one of the more powerful decks in Modern, and I'm expecting to see at least a couple copies of it here this weekend.
Interesting. That's a good bullet for the Bant Eldrazi. Had not thought about that. Let's move on to the next slide. Now we got some more 4 and 3-ofs, not a bunch of 1-ofs.
Yep.
Noble Hierarch, Wall of Roots, these are cards you play in most decks in Modern.
Yep, and one of the big upgrades we have playing this iteration of Chord over Angel-Chord is that Noble Hierarch is an upgrade from Birds of Paradise because it has that exalted text, so it is doing something relevant when it's done just making mana.
Wall of Roots great with Chord of Calling, of course, holding off some early attackers. 3 Scavenging Ooze is a lot.
Yeah, Scavenging Ooze is one of your best cards, not only against decks like Dredge, but it's also very good against Jund and Abzan and Grixis and Jeskai. Like, all of those decks are interacting with their graveyard, and all of those decks want to take your large threat off the table, which Scavenging Ooze quickly becomes because those decks are killing our other creatures.
Sure. All right, good enough. Move on to the next. Voice Resurgence, my favorite card. You're playing 3 copies. I approve.
Yep.
Just a solid card in Modern.
Yeah, it's very powerful in general. Again, good against all those really removal-dense decks. Even when your opponent's spending something like a Path to Exile on your Voice of Resurgence, you're pretty happy with that exchange because then it's a path that's not killing a Siege Rhino, or it's not killing a large Scavenging Ooze or your Restoration Angel. 3
Eternal Witness, as you mentioned. This is the kind of keeps the engine going between your Chord of Callings and all your other fun things.
Yep, it's our green Snapcaster Mage. It rebuys Path to Exiles. It rebuys fetch lands a lot because you want to make sure you hit all of your land drops in your deck that's trying to play, 8 mana Chord of Callings.
Siege Rhino.
Standard All-Star. Again, thinking about the decks that I'm expecting to see here this weekend, this card, its stats line up reasonably against Tassigurs and 4 or 5 Tarmogoyfs, and also provides a nice life swing against the aggressive decks that can exist in the format.
Okay, moving on. More 1-ofs here. Spike Feeder, of course, comboing with Archangel of Thune. Also just kind of good if you need a boost of life. Thragtusk, similar. Oars of Pontiff has always been a card you're playing in these decks, just an all-star against stuff like Affinity, Infect.
Yep. It's also Grixis Delver. I'm expecting, Jones is here. We got to kill those Pyromancers and all those tokens. Just a super flexible card.
Okay, next slide. Spellskite, Pride Mage, Selfless Spirit. This card's picking up play in Modern. You, of course, are on top of that. Talk about these three choices here.
So Spellskite's just good. Not only is it a protection for when we're trying to combo ourselves, but it's also a good anti-card for decks like Infect and Burn and Death Shadow. It's very potential there as well. Quasly Pride Mage is great because even when its text box isn't relevant, you're mostly fine casting a 3-power attacker for 2 resources. The fact that we also have Noble Hierarchs in this deck means the Exalted text kind of stacks up and allows you to really push through one large attacker a lot of the time.
Wouldn't be bad pushing a Selfless Spirit across, right?
Yeah, Selfless Spirit. This card makes combat in Modern just as miserable as it does in Standard for people. When this card is in play, all of a sudden all of their attacks and their blocks become much, much worse.
Now, you couldn't fit in an Archangel Avacyn in this deck?
Kind of a liability with all our other little guys, but it's definitely in my box of cards we sometimes play.
Okay, next slide. Here's the kind of the engine of the deck. Court of Calling, you can go into that here in a second, but also 4 Path to Exile and 3 Collective Brutality, an all-star in Modern.
Yep, so one of the big questions I got is I spend a lot of time screwing around with Eldritch Evolution, and I'm back to Court of Calling now because really I think just the flexibility that this card offers, that you can't overstate how powerful instant speed interaction is in a format like Modern. It allows your opponent to not know what they're playing around as things are going on, and it allows you to do things like leave your mana up and then use it at their end steps, threaten that Path to Exile or that Restoration Angel. They're not quite sure exactly what you're leaving mana up for.
Mm-hmm. Now go over Brutality, because this card's been popping up in most decks that can play it. It's just got a bunch of utility in a ton of different matchups, and is almost never dead.
Yeah, so this is actually the card that pushed Kiki towards being more black, and it's the reason why this Abzan base is so powerful. I think this card is playable in essentially every Modern deck that has black mana in it. It allows you to generate those tempo swings that you really need against the super aggressive decks in Modern. You can kill their Goblin Guide and drain the burn player and take a Boros Charm out of their hand. Against Infect, you can kill their Glistener Elf and take one of their protection spells out of their hand. And even if they're burning a protection spell to save their elf, you've now taken 2 tools away from them, so now you're better suited to actually kill that thing next time you have the availability to.
Okay, moving on. Now we move into the lands. You got a bunch of utility lands here between Gavany Township, Horizon Canopy, Razorverge Thicket here.
Yep, so Gavany Township's a card that you just never had room for in a deck with a triple red card. So here we have room to leverage 2 copies of it. It's just excellent at breaking board stalls. Horizon Canopy is that card you want to play when I think I need another land, but I don't want to commit to playing another land, so we can easily cycle that in the mid to late game when we no longer need the resources. Stirring Wildwood gives us, again, just a little bit more utility, but not quite as much pain as a 3rd Horizon Canopy would. And again, also expecting some Delver of Secrets or Mantis Riders in this tournament, and its 3/4 stats are very reasonable against all of those.
Makes sense. Move on to the rest of the lands here. Fetch land mana base.
Yep.
Gonna be fetching your dual lands.
Yep.
And I assume you have a
all of our shocks, and then
decent amount of
we have
basics.
5 basics in this deck, which is huge. We have some Blood Moon lovers in this tournament, and just against Path to Exile decks, like being able to go and get your 5th basic when someone snap paths you is it's very powerful.
Okay, move on to the sideboard here. Angel-Chord is the card that stands out to me when I looked at your sideboard. What's going on?
So this was the 12th hour edition. One of my buddies messaged me and he's like, I've got the card that we need for your sideboard, and he sends me Angel-Chord, and I was just like, well, we wanted some slots that could be extra removal for the threats in the Delver decks, but also allow you to enable a little bit of grind against control and other mid-range decks. So being able to use the Sign in Blood mode to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life, and even the distribute 1/1 counters. We mentioned Siege Rhino earlier, like that was a very powerful interaction in Standard for a reason, like making your trample creature more powerful is huge. It also allows you to do things like counter a Lightning Bolt on your Voice of Resurgence when they're expecting that to kill it, and now you have a bigger threat, and the removal was negated.
All right, Thoughtseize here, a little hand disruption, and then of course some graveyard interaction with Surgical.
Yep, this is a fantastic Surgical Extraction deck because we have all of the Eternal Witnesses to rebuy the Surgical Extractions. Surgical Extraction alongside Thoughtseize or Collective Brutality allows you to build your own slaughter games essentially against a lot of the spell-based combo decks. There's the next slide. We have some Fulminator Mages as well, so it's a build your own Crumble to Dust against Tron. Kind of just a lot of flexibility there.
Right, you have a bunch of flexibility, and just being able to use it multiple times I think is very important, because a lot of the decks, you see Snapcaster Mages using it again to really cripple Dredge, you kind of have the same interaction.
The first hate card doesn't beat Dredge. It's the second and the third that put the nail in the coffin. So,
all right, you got Eidolon of Rhetoric here, good against kind of the spell-based combo decks.
Yep, this card also has a lot of added value against the Snapcaster Mage decks in the format. A lot of them are kind of short on non-Lightning Bolt removal, so you're able to tie up their Snapcaster Mages. You can also like chord for this in response to a Snapcaster trigger targeting something, and then they can't flash it back.
Pretty nice there. One Eldritch Evolution. You couldn't give this card up entirely.
So, I'm expecting at least one player to show up with Tron in this tournament, and for a while I had 3 Fulminator Mages on my sideboard. And while there's a lot of situations where you want to chord for the second Fulminator Mage, you rarely ever need to search for the third copy. So what Eldritch Evolution allows us to do is kind of have a third Fulminator Mage that we can cast on turn 2 or turn 3, but it's also flexible in that it's a 4th Scavenging Ooze very quickly against Dredge, and it's a 2nd Eidolon of Rhetoric very quickly against spell-based combo decks. So just like some flexibility, even if it loses a little bit of the punch an actual Fulminator would have.
All right, next slide. Got another Pontiff here. You just can't go wrong with this card in the matchups where you want it.
Yeah, exactly. It's in the matchups where you want to chord for it, like drawing it is just fantastic. Like casting this card on turn 2 and turn 3 against Lingering Souls decks is just wonderful.
Any deck that fears this card knows it's usually a 1-of in your deck, and it's just like, I hope it's not in their hand.
Yep.
So, Reclamation Sage, good at what it does. Maelstrom Pulse kills anything you need to kill, basically.
Yeah, it's a super flexible card. It's another way to tag their Tarmogoyf. It also come in against a deck like Tron and clean up Karns that are on a lot of loyalty, or Ugins that you otherwise wouldn't be beating.
Okay. Got anything else here?
No,
does not look like it. Now, one thing that's interesting, you playing this deck, you mentioned it to me before the deck tech. This deck is very good when you know the deck lists everyone's playing. So you kind of know what piece you need, what kind of hands you can keep with the deck that's kind of all over the place.
Yep.
Do you think there's any of that going against you, though, when everyone knows what the pieces are in your deck?
So, it's tough to memorize a giant list of bullets, and, even sometimes I have a hard time. So, if they're just looking at my deck list for even 5-10 minutes beforehand, they're not always going to be able to remember and all the mana costs and everything and all that jazz. And a lot of times there's not an objectively single best card to get in a lot of situations. So if there's multiple cards, I can kind of pivot, move around it, especially with the instant speed that Court of Calling offers.
Okay, lastly, where do you think the Modern metagame is? A lot of people are calling Modern the most important part of day 1. It's the the format you have to play to ensure you make day 2. What do you think the metagame's going to look like?
My spreadsheet predictions had a lot of Infect in the Modern column. I feel like that's the very kind of level 1 deck for this tournament, but I also think that deck's a little bit worse when people know that that's what you're playing, which might force people to gravitate towards more Grixis, Delver, and Jund and Abzan decks, which I think this is an excellent matchup against, so I'm hoping that's what ends up happening.
All right, well, you've had a great year. I'm sure you're hoping to make it a little bit better with a strong finish here this weekend. Jeff, we're glad to have you. Thanks for joining me here in the Sideboard. Stay tuned to StarCityGames.com all weekend long for the action here in Roanoke.